Now, in the election of 1960, John F. Kennedy defeated Richard Nixon in the race for president after a close election. Kennedy was determined to fight the Cold War, and he wanted to defeat the Soviet Union in the space race. Now, the Soviet Union had already sent a man to space on a satellite, okay? And they also tested the first intercontinental ballistic missiles. So Kennedy was calling for the United States to put a man on the moon, all right? Trying to put a statement out there that the United States is making progress in the space race. Now, as part of his Cold War strategy, Kennedy also created the Peace Corps. So people could sign up for the Peace Corps and they travel around the world helping impoverished people in other countries through education and economic support. Okay, so this is showing how a capitalist country could economically benefit other countries around the world. All right, showing how capitalism can be successful for them so that they don't move towards communism. Kennedy also created an economic plan known as the Alliance for Progress. Now, this economic plan provided financial assistance to countries in Latin America. Like the Peace Corps, this helped the image of the United States and the image of capitalism as a source for improving the world. But in reality, the Alliance for Progress only benefited the wealthy and the political elite in Latin American countries because they were the ones in charge of the program, right? And they were able to take the majority of the funds for themselves. So ultimately, you'll see Kennedy making strides in the Cold War, trying to support capitalism and democracy around the world. One of the major conflicts that took place during the Kennedy administration was the conflict surrounding Cuba. Since Cuba gained its independence, it had been under the economic influence of the United States. Remember, the Cuban president, Fulgencio Batista, had acted as a dictator who manipulated elections and controlled the press. In 1958, Fidel Castro led a successful revolution against Batista, who fled the country. Now, the United States did not support the Castro regime, especially after he signed a trade deal with the Soviet Union. The CIA had trained and armed an insurgent force made up of Cubans who had went into exile when Castro took over, and they were going to invade Cuba at the Bay of Pigs. Okay, Bay of Pigs, this is a location on Cuba. But the invasion was a complete failure. Okay, so the CIA was training and arming this insurgent force, but they were not successful in taking over Cuba from Castro. Okay, so Castro's forces, they captured most of the insurgents, and this was a huge embarrassment to the Kennedy administration. The CIA came up with several other plans to try to assassinate Castro, but none were ever successfully carried out. In August of 1961, we came extremely close to nuclear war in one of the most intense confrontations of the Cold War. The Soviet Union had placed missiles on Cuba, which was a direct nuclear threat to the United States. Kennedy responded by using the Navy to blockade Cuba until the missiles were finally removed. If he would have ordered an attack on Cuba like his advisors had suggested, there could have been a nuclear war. Ultimately, the Soviet Union agreed to remove the missiles, but the US had to remove nuclear missiles of their own, which they had in Turkey that were threatening the Soviet Union. So came really close to a nuclear war, but ultimately both sides came to a compromise. They removed their nuclear missiles, and this nuclear war was averted. Now, after the Birmingham protests, there was pressure on John F. Kennedy to support a civil rights act, which he eventually did. But Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas in late 1963 as he rode around in a convertible car, right? There was no top there, and he was shot in the head, and he was ultimately killed, right? He was reportedly shot by a man named Lee Harvey Oswald, but there are multiple conspiracies out there that say possibly the mafia or political rivals or some other organization had something to do with Kennedy's assassination. Now, after Kennedy's death, his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, became president of the country. Johnson pushed for Kennedy's Civil Rights Act, which was passed by Congress in 1964. The act made it illegal to discriminate against anyone due to race or gender in terms of providing services in private businesses or in public institutions and in hiring practices. So basically, segregation, for example, would be illegal because that's discriminating somebody based on their race, okay? So the Civil Rights Act was a major victory for the civil rights movement. But the Civil Rights Act did not protect the voting rights of minority groups. So a coalition of several civil rights organizations led a voter registration campaign in Mississippi in 1964, and this is known as the Freedom Summer, okay, or Freedom Summer. They were trying to increase the African American vote, but they faced racial violence as 35 bombs were set off during the campaign and many activists were beaten. Okay, so activists basically are getting some pushback as they are trying their best to increase the African American vote in the South. All right, now in 1965, civil rights activists who were led by Dr. Martin Luther King attempted a march, okay, a march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, okay? And so the idea of this march was they're trying to promote African American voting rights. But again, violence was used to try to stop the civil rights movement. The state police attacked the marchers with tear gas and various weapons, including whips. But since the attack got national attention, pressure was put on Congress to pass a Voting Rights Act, which they did in 1965. The act banned any type of racial discrimination, including literacy tests, okay, so now the literacy tests are gone, in relation to voting, okay, so any type of racial discrimination in relation to voting, that is now illegal, okay. Now, states that had passed restrictive voting laws in the past had to get federal approval before passing any laws related to voting, okay, so they have to get federal approval before they could pass any law that's related to voting, and they had to prove that the laws were not discriminatory. Okay, this is all part of the Voting Rights Act that was passed in 1965. Also, federal officials were sent to certain voting polls where discrimination had taken place in the past, and so they're sent there to monitor the situation on voting days. Okay, so you see yet another victory for the civil rights movement with the passing of the Voting Rights Act.